Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. For today's video, I decided to take a look at another classic Pixar film, this time the 2009 movie Up. And seeing as I've already discussed the origins of Pixar in an earlier review, this time I'll restrict myself to the origins of the film. The story about the story. If you're familiar with the plot of Up, you're probably unsurprised to learn that its origin was a very literal escapist fantasy. Pete Docter, one of the main figures at Pixar, came up with a fantasy of a house lifting off the ground on a balloon and escaping the pains of everyday life, and he worked with writers Tom McCarthy and Bob Peterson to build a story outward from that basic concept. Their first idea was to have a floating city on an alien planet and two rival brothers who have to understand each other. But when Doctor drew a grumpy old man holding some smiling balloons, they knew they had their protagonist. Once they had their story, the creators decided on their relatively small voice cast. The protagonist, Carl Fredricksen, is played by the late, great Ed Asner, whose breakout role was Lou Grant, the grumpy boss on The Mary Tyler Moore Show. He would remain a TV actor for most of his career, although he also lent his unmistakable voice to animated TV shows like the 90s Spider-Man series, the 90s Batman series, and the Gargoyles series, which, guess what, came out in the 90s. Starring opposite Asner is the equally late and great Christopher Plummer, who got his start on Broadway. His popularity in Hollywood began in 1965 with the classic musical The Sound of Music, where he played the father of the Van Trapp family. Film and stage would continue to be his mediums of choice, and both he and Asner continued acting right up until their deaths in 2021. They were both 91 at the time. The other main actors are Bob Peterson as Doug the dog, and yes, that's the same guy who helped write the story. And finally, Jordan Nagai as Russell. Nagai was apparently cast because of his resemblance to the Russell character, rather than his acting skill. And this also marked the first time Pixar cast an Asian American actor to portray an Asian American character. In total, the film cost $175 million to make, but received $735.1 million from the box office, making it one of the top 10 most successful movies made by Pixar, or at least one of the most successful movies made before 2020. Since Pixar now releases their films on streaming platforms immediately, box office income doesn't really mean anything anymore. Regardless, Up also received almost universal praise from the critics, who liked the story, the characters, the actors, the themes, the animation, everything. And I obviously liked it too, since it was my idea to review it, but how about we break things down in the next section? The review. Carl Fredricksen is an old man who lost his wife Ellie just before they could fulfill their lifelong dream of going to Paradise Falls, a remote valley in South America. He stays for a while in his old house doing nothing but mourning her passing, but when reality comes knocking, he decides to screw it all and lift his house on helium balloons so he can take the whole thing to South America. However, he accidentally brings along Russell, an 8-year-old wilderness explorer, basically a Cub Scout, who was under the porch when the house lifted off. The two reach Paradise Falls the next day, but because the house is still some distance from the titular waterfall, Carl and Russell tie themselves to the garden hose and pull the still floating house across the valley. Along the way, they meet Kevin, an exotic flightless bird, and Doug, a golden retriever with a special collar that lets him speak English. However, Doug belongs to a pack of dogs that in turn belong to Charles Muntz, an explorer who wants to capture Kevin and bring her back to civilization. Charles also kills every human who comes to Paradise Falls because of a paranoid belief that they all want to capture the bird before he can, and so that leads him into conflict with Carl and Russell. The two escape his clutches, along with Carl's house, but when Kevin gets captured, Carl has to empty out his house so he can ride it to the rescue. Something I've heard about Up is that if you don't cry within the first 15 minutes, either you have no heart or you aren't paying attention. Those 15 minutes tell the complete story of Carl and Ellie's life together, and while this story is completely independent of the rest of the film, you can potentially leave it out and not realize that it's gone. It's a very well told story, and it really helps you understand why Carl is the way he is, why he makes the choices he makes, and also why he was able to inflate a couple thousand balloons overnight. And I should add that I'm no exception to the rule. In fact, the whole thing reminds me of my grandparents, who died back when this film was relatively new. Another thing I like about the film is the way it handles the talking dogs. While they are portrayed as more intelligent than the average real dog, and we never find out how Charles has so many different dog breeds even after being cut off from civilization for decades, the dogs still aren't as smart as a human, and they have different priorities than a human would. So while the dogs of the film are exaggerated, much like the physics and the character designs, they're still recognizably dogs. However, the weak point of the movie would have to be Russell. When I found out his voice actor had no previous experience with acting, I was not surprised at all. Jordan the guy might have the same sort of personality as Russell, but he also has that beginner's enunciation where you can tell he's reading off of a script rather than saying what the character would say. I will say that his acting isn't that bad, and it's understandable since he's a child with no experience, but it still needs to be pointed out. Overall, though, Up is a film that lives up to its reputation and has an unusually broad appeal that makes it an effective story no matter how old or young you are. As such, I cannot recommend it highly enough. The analysis. As people grow older, they tend to spend more and more time in their memories rather than in their present. And why wouldn't we? When we were younger, we were more successful, more active, more attractive, and more hopeful. We were living the best days of our lives, and our existence in the present is nothing more than the shadow of our glory years. So why not forget about the present for a while and relive the better times? Or if it's not our best days we want to revisit, then it's our regrets. Maybe there were some good times, but we could have done them better. Or there were some mistakes we made that we can never undo and never let go. Carl falls into the second category. While he and his wife were never able to have a child, that's something they could live with. But they also never made it to Paradise Falls, never got to experience the one big adventure they had always wanted to go on. And Carl is so consumed by this regret that he stops living in the present, stops existing in the world that he can change, so he can instead live in a past world that he can't. And so Carl turns his house into a museum, one that looks exactly the way it did the day that Ellie died. The only reason he does anything is because the world gets in the way and he has no choice but to take action, or else his museum will be taken from him. And even then, his action is to bring his house to Paradise Falls, complete the monument he has made to his wife. It's only after new people enter his life that Carl finds new reasons to keep living, new reasons to exist in the present and not just the past. And to pursue this new beginning, one thing he has to do is throw out all the old junk he no longer needs. He has to destroy the monument he made because he doesn't need it. He has his memories, and that's enough. That's more than enough. And while his best days might be behind him, Carl is still capable of making new memories and having an impact on the world around him. Then there's the second main theme, which is the importance of banality. Russell says it directly at one point. Big adventures don't matter nearly as much as all the little things you do every day. They may be swiftly forgotten, but they fill up the majority of your life, and they add up to create a collective memory that can hold so much more weight than a single adventure ever could. You can't build a story from a bunch of quiet, conflict-free moments, but you can build a character with them, and that can be so much more important. And for that matter, an important moment doesn't have to be a grand global thing to shape your life and give it meaning. Because Carl is so fixated on the one moment with his wife that he didn't have, he's ignoring all of the million moments he did have with her. It's just lucky for him that she didn't forget. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.